Good afternoon. I'm Francis Levy, co-director of the Philoctetes Center. And sitting over there is Ed Nersessian, who is co-director of the Philoctetes Center. My wife says to tell you I just got back from Nigeria. Now, I'm very happy to invite all of you here for Mind, Brain, and Spirituality. David Pincus is director of the Consortium for Mind, Brain Studies at Summa Hospital of Akron and Northeastern Ohio University's College of Medicine. He is a member of the Cleveland Psychoanalytic Center and affiliated with Case Western Reserve University's Departments of Psychiatry and Psychology. Dr. Pincus will moderate today's panel and introduce the other panelists. So I give you Dr. Pincus, and we have a panelist who is on the way. Bergmann.
Martin Bergmann.
Okay, but we can start and you'll introduce.
Right.
So thank you.
Hello, everybody. So we've agreed that each person would say what they would like to say about themselves. So I'll begin with Siri Hustvedt.
I'm a novelist and an essayist. 3 novels, 2 books of essays, and I have an abiding interest in the brain-mind question.
All right. And Jaak Panksepp.
Thank you, David. I'm Jaak Panksepp, and I wanted to be a clinician, but realized in my era, clinicians knew nothing about emotions, so I decided to become a neuroscientist instead, and generated my own vision of what emotions are at the primary process level. And now I am eager to rejoin the clinical community, and the psychoanalytic community has welcomed me for many years, which has been truly delightful. The person who was instrumental in bringing me here was Morty Ostow. And we're here to celebrate Morty Ostow's last contribution. And I hope we really have a very stimulating and positive time and remember this fine soul for the wonderful person he was.
I'm Thandeka. Oops.
Hi.
Sorry.
Reverend
Okay.
Thandeka.
Yes, I'm Thandeka. I'm a theologian and minister. And I've just finished my 3rd book, which is volume 1 of my systematic theology, called Soul Inventions. Subtitle is The Science, Art, and Personal Experience of Faith, in which I use most especially the work of Jaak as a tool to investigate the affective content of the human soul, tracing it through Paul, Augustine, Luther, and Friedrich Schleiermacher, who's the father of modern Protestant theology, showing how the neurosciences can be used to lift up aspects of the human soul that have been set aside within traditional doctrinal claims.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And Martin Bergmann, who just arrived. Would you care?
I have known Morty Ostow for many, many years, and I owe him a great deal. About more than 30 years ago, he invited me to join a seminar in the Jewish Theological Seminary that consisted of a few analysts and Jewish scholars and had at its topic Crisis in Jewish History. I don't remember anymore what we talked about as much, but as a result of that, I became a very good friend of Jack Arlo and other people. So that was the first debt that I have to Morty. Then the second major debt was in 1975 when my father died. As an act of mourning, I wrote a paper called Freud's Jewish Identity, and I published that in the Annals of the Israeli Society. I presented it as a lecture to the New York Psychoanalytic, and it evoked the anger of Kurt Eisler. At that point, the Miriam told Morty that he has to accept to become the second discussant and to help me survive. Well, it wasn't quite that serious, and I would have survived even without him. However, it was a major nice thing that he did for me. But the most important thing that I owe to Morty was that he introduced me into the Fund for Psychoanalytic Research and Development. That place was a very, very growth-promoting place. I think I paid my dues to this organization because I published 3 books. The first one had to do with one group that we had on anti-Semitism, and I wrote a book called In the Shadow of Moloch, the effect of the sacrifice of infants on Western religions. Later on, I wrote 2 more books, one the Hartmann era and the other the psychoanalytic history of dissidents in psychoanalysis, and all of them, the last 2 ones were sponsored by the fund. So my debt to Morty is very great. Do you want me now to give my own view of this book, or do you want me to wait until?
Well, what we were going to do is to go around and each of us talk about the book, and then.
So, do you want me to start to talk about the book, or would you rather somebody else start?
well, I just. Let me say something first, and then we can go to you.
Introduce things.
I want to introduce things, and then we can go to you.
By all
means. All right? Sure. So we'll go this way around.
Yeah.
We were going to post a picture, and we made a number of prints of it around, of Morty sitting, my son and I did it, superimposed over the Niagara Falls. And I don't know if there are any pictures around or if people have seen them, but it's one of the images that I always had of Morty in my experience of him, and is that he was always a pioneer. He was the first person to write about psychopharmacology within psychoanalysis in the 1950s. And his interest in Judaism in many ways was against what some psychoanalytic theory would have been comfortable with, but he persisted with his interests throughout his life. And I think that this book represents that synthesis for him. I think it's important to understand that while we're going to refer to the book and talk about how the book has affected us and our experiences with it and with Morty, we're also going to depart from the book to a more general discussion. I think it's important to keep in mind that Morty's book is a psychoanalytic book. I spent a lot of time with him in looking over the manuscript, and I tried to get him to stretch it outside of psychoanalysis, but he really didn't want to. It was very important for him to be able to talk about spirituality within the context of psychoanalysis. And I would like to say a couple of things that, for those of you who have not read the book, were high points of his model of spirituality in some very cursory form. And then I wanted to read to you a very short spiritual experience that he had here in the book that was given to him by a friend of his. The basic model for Morty is that spiritual experience is a lifelong quest for a unity, of a reconnection. And for him it was in a memorial category and back to the transitional space between the mother-infant dialogue. And so in that way, one could consider that reductionistic, and yet Morty was very respectful in the book to talk about transitional phenomena as part of our ongoing adult experience for all of us at all times. He talked about a temporal and spatial shift in one's experience of any spiritual experience is some shift in ordinary space-time boundaries, whether it's about the world around or about oneself. And that almost always there is a feeling of belonging, even if there is a transcendental experience that takes one beyond the immediacies of the time and space that one is in. There is a sense of belonging in that space almost entirely. And finally, that a spiritual experience does not require a belief in God. And so I want to then turn very briefly, before we get to you, Martin, with the first account in the book, and I'll read it. Here's an account of the unusual experience that I had, which I told you about the other evening. It occurred at the beginning of August, at a time when Helen was either in the hospital or had just returned home. Now I'm not exactly sure which. I went swimming at our community pool, which is located at the edge of the bay. As I regularly do, I looked out over the water before I went into the dressing room to change. Suddenly, everything seemed strangely, fascinatingly beautiful. The sky was a deep blue, the water seemed motionless and silvery. The clouds in the heavens seemed to be assembled in a very special way, huge and fluffy and very white. Yet they were distributed over the heavens in a sparse manner. Over to the side, a white heron rested on the water, completely motionless. I was aware that this was a scene of transcendent beauty. Nothing moved. Time seemed to stand still. Although I'm a complete unbeliever, twice there came into my mind the phrases from the book of Psalms in Hebrew, Hashamayim mesaprim kavod el uma aseh yadav magid harakia. And that means the heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky recites the work of his hands. I looked away and I looked back at the scene, and it remained unchanged. For a moment, I had the thought of going to the lifeguard and urging him to come and look. But I knew that there was something very personal about what I was living through. I had been on that same spot scores, perhaps hundreds of times, but never had had that sensation before. As I thought about the experience, there came to my mind naturally Freud's discussion of the oceanic feeling, but more than that, I thought of two poems. First was Wordsworth's, "My heart leaps up when I behold a rainbow in the sky." Until now, I had thought of that kind of a trite phrase. But after this experience, I can understand what the poet was trying to express, or more accurately, what he was feeling. What really moved me was recalling Keats' sonnet on first looking into Chapman's Homer, in which he described the awesome sensation in terms of "then felt I like some watcher of the skies when a new planet swims into his ken." And further on in the same poem, when he imagines what it was to be the first European to stand on a peak and see the limitless, boundless Pacific Ocean, a mixture of awe and wonder. And finally, he mentions two thoughts may be relevant. First, my mother died at the beginning of August. And second, I recalled when I was a youngster of 12 or 13, sitting in the front row in a basement synagogue of our boys' club on a beautiful Sunday morning, looking beyond the neighboring wooden fence and past some decrepit buildings towards a beautiful blue sky. Why I retain that moment in my memory all these years, I do not know, but it seems to me that it might represent a smaller version of what I experienced on the shores of the bay. So, this is a typical classical spiritual experience that Morty describes. I think that we can now, Martin, we can go around the room and talk about what the book meant for each of us. I think ultimately we're going to need to define our terms at some point. Terms like, what is spirituality? What is the soul? what is biology,
Wow.
what is religion. And in giving a talk about this topic 2 weeks ago in Cleveland, all I can tell you is it quickly becomes a very busy place. So we'll begin with you, though, Martin. Go ahead.
With me?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I regard, you know, there is a question when you are having a commemorative meeting whether we should obey the Latin proverb, de mortuis nisi bonum, about the dead, nothing but good, or whether we want to have a serious discussion about the book. If you want to say just good things, I would say the fact that Morty sat down, particularly after the death of Miriam, and wrote this book. It's an amazing achievement. It's a great achievement of sublimation, of combining his interests and creating something which he wanted to do for many years, and there is absolutely no doubt that the result is an interesting book. It even has a certain poetic quality which is otherwise not characteristic of Morty's writing. So far, so good. But if you also want me to discuss the book in a serious sense of my evaluation, then I have to go take off this one hat and put on another one. And then I have some serious misgivings or even issues with that book. And I don't have a copy of it, but Morty sent me his manuscript and I read it, and at that time, and I tried to tell him a little bit about it, but I had to be a little bit careful. He was already not well. So what is basically the problem? First of all, I am not sure that psychoanalysis ought to be able to discuss everything in the world. There are certain things which are of no particular interest, which may be of interest to me, Martin Bergmann, but not to me, the analyst. It doesn't have to do very much with psychoanalysis. And why Morty wanted psychoanalysis to deal with these experiences that he describes is not.
We can still hear you. Go ahead.
Is not so clear, because I know that I myself have had these kind of mystical experiences. I remember them very vividly when one particular one, which was on the mountains, the high mountains of Switzerland, where suddenly the light and everything else had a very powerful intensity. I had the sense of being grateful to be able to see that, and a kind of general thankfulness to my good faith to be able to have this experience. Is this an analytic answer? Absolutely not. Did I wish to analyze the statement and to connect it with my mother? No. In other words, I think that experiences have a certain autonomy. And not everything has to be investigated, and not everything is profitable to investigate. So even if you establish that the mystical experiences are connected with the relationship between the infant and his mother, I personally don't think that you have gained very much. So that's my first point. The second point, it certainly is the awe experiences which Morty connected to to these mystical experiences are certainly very important experiences. And indeed, a person who is not capable of all experiences has probably something missing. But it doesn't mean that psychoanalysis has at its disposal ways of understanding the all experience, nor is it likely that everybody would have the same background to their all experiences.
Were you going to go to your third point?
To what?
To your third point.
Well, I don't know. Do you want me to cut something out? Or?
Well, what I wanted to do was, I think that you have a third point as well, and I wanted us to continue to go around the room a little bit.
If I had it, it's gone. It will come. I want to make only one remark, and that is...
So it's still there.
No, it's not a third point. We have only one psychoanalytic paper on awe, and that is Phyllis Greenacre's Penis Envy and Penis Awe. Well, that is an important difference, but it doesn't cover all experience. Now I have my third point. In one of the meetings that we had, I mentioned, I don't anymore remember in what connection, a famous statement by the medieval Hebrew poet Yehuda Halevi. This I will first state it in Hebrew and then I will state it in English. The poet addresses God and says, "As I walked towards thee, God, I found you on your way towards me." In Hebrew, it's even more beautiful because it's condensed into 3 words. Betzeti likratcha, likrati metzaticha. 4 words. Now, I quoted that to Morty, and Morty persuaded the president of his synagogue to mark those words on the holy tabernacle at the temple. So that was a kind of an indication of the kind of exchanges that he and I often had. That was my third point.
Thank you, sir. Siri.
Well, I was part of this discussion group that met every month, and I did not know Morty very well at all. I do know that the one time I really got his attention was when I told a little story about euphoric experiences that I've had before migraine, which are very wonderful experiences. You feel that the world is perfect, and this, of course, is pathological because it's followed by a horrifying head event. Nevertheless, he got very, very interested in that, and I have to say that I have been interested in mysticism from the point of view of neurological debility. And I went back and I actually found a mystic that I read many years ago, and Julian of Norwich. And she is, I have to say that I rather agree with you. There are mystical experiences that do not seem to add up to going back to the union with the mother or being reduced to that. So, but here's one that gives something to Morty's point. It's Julian of Norwich. She lived from 1342 to 1423, and she wrote, "As truly as God is our Father, so truly is God our Mother. What do you wish to know your Lord's meaning in this thing? Know it well. Love was his meaning. Who reveals it to you? Love. What did he reveal to you? Love. Why does he reveal it to you? Love." It's quite a beautiful quote, huh? Of course, I think when we get to St. Teresa and to some of the other Christian mystics, we are in a whole other land. I think St. Teresa didn't have psychiatric problems. She was actually a brilliant woman. Morty says that she probably had psychiatric problems. I think that she was an epileptic, and there's quite a bit of material on her epilepsy. In fact, in her brilliant autobiography, she talks about waking up from unconsciousness after having bitten her tongue to pieces. That seems to be rather strong. And then, of course, we have one of the other most famous epileptics, which is Dostoevsky. And just one more quote, and then we will go to Jaak. This is from The Idiot. Probably many of you know it already, but it's extremely beautiful, and it is very much autobiographical. It's Prince Myshkin. And here's a little quote. His mind and heart were flooded with extraordinary light. All his uneasiness, all his doubts, all his anxieties were relieved at once. They were all merged in a lofty calm, full of serene, harmonious joy and hope. Full of knowledge and the ultimate cause of things. Then a little later he gets a feeling unknown and undivined until then of completeness, proportion, of reconciliation, and of ecstatic devotional merging into the highest synthesis of life. Myshkin, I'm shortening, had actually said to himself at that second that for the infinite happiness he felt in it, that second might really be worth the whole of life. At that moment, and now it's in Myshkin's voice, I seem somehow to understand that there shall be no more time. Probably this is the very second which was not long enough for the water to be spilt out of Muhammad's pitcher, though the epileptic prophet had time to gaze at all the habitations of Allah.
Very nice.
Yeah, well, it's a beautiful passage. Again, how this can actually be reduced, certainly to say epileptics have this, or I have this as a migraineur. It doesn't reduce the power of the experience itself. I guess that's the point.
Right.
Even if it is electrical activity, in the brain, the experience is what it is itself. Yeah.
Jaak.
I don't know what psychoanalysis is, but I think the most important issue for this kind of book is whether he was probing reality in a very meaningful and interesting way, and I do believe he was. And I believe our capacity to maybe have a more harmonious and spiritual world depends upon people buying into some kind of a shared reality. And every tribe has its own mythology, and they want to see this mythology as reality, but underneath there is a common theme. And I don't think Morty was too far away to suggest that among these very important aspects of life, the most important feature is our deep desire for each other, which is represented in the social bond, and therefore we re-symbolize it in great gods that are more powerful than us. So I think that's a fundamental truth, and if it is, and if it percolated throughout many societies, we might be a better world. Spirituality, I also don't know what spirituality is, but I always listen to my wife, as I believe Morty listened to his wife. And my wife has a vision of spirituality which she willingly shares with me repeatedly, to the point where I feel I have a little touch on spirituality, and which is that when we're out in nature, she's always pointing out how spiritual the other animals are. Every last one of them out there in the woods, the birds, raccoons, the insects, maybe the flowers, they're all spiritual creatures. And I finally understand the meaning. The spirituality ultimately is being in the world as yourself and completely as yourself and not someone else. And as soon as you can achieve that, you've achieved a deep spirituality. So the flickers are now on the Palouse. And the flickers are some of the early birds coming back, and they're feeding and they're sharing and they're flying together with always flying together with each other. And you look at them and say, if there's anything more to spirituality, I don't know what it is, but this I feel as being spiritual. So, how one defines these things, David's going to ask us to define things. When you get a chance, ask me how I would define mind.
All right, I'll do that.
I might still remember what is in my mind right now.
All right. Thandeka.
But a spiritual experience was just about a year ago with Reverend Thandeka, who contacted me by email and was fascinated by affective neuroscience. I was totally shocked. And I was going to be in Chicago, which is your hometown, kind of. And we met and we resonated very much.
Yes.
So I'd like to pass it on to you.
Thank you. And I do assign my theological students Jaak's affective neuroscience as one of the texts to be read. So I'm very interested in Morty's book for several reasons. First off, because he defines spirituality as an affective experience. So that caught my attention. Freud, as of course we all know, referred to the object of psychoanalysis as strangled affect. So of course we have to pay attention to affect. Now, from the tradition from which I come, the release from affect, from strangled affect, Erlösung, is referred to as redemption. So I was particularly interested in this way, in the way in which Morty refers to Rudolf Otto, the idea of the holy, as a reference for a psychological interest in affect as the foundation of religious experience and mysticism and spirituality. Rudolf Otto is an interpretation of the work of Friedrich Schleiermacher. And most of my work is focused on Friedrich Schleiermacher, 19th century German theologian who's the father of modern Protestant theology, hermeneutics, and other fields as well. Anyway, Schleiermacher is greatly misunderstood by the traditions that look back to him, Protestant liberal theology, because Schleiermacher made affect the foundational reference for religious experience. That interaffective experience of being inextricably interwoven with all of life. He said that this is a fundamental structure of human nature, this experience, which means that when we're in this state, every single moment of our lives, no matter what is going on, can be experienced as a moment of perfection. The foundational claim of Schleiermacher is that this reference for theological reflection and religious experience, that is, affect, is not in and of itself a religious experience. Schleiermacher is thus referred to as the father of modern Protestant theology and liberal theology because instead of making God or church tradition or revelation or the Bible the foundation of religious experience, he made something about human nature its foundation. And thus the foundation of liberal religion became something that was not religious. So, where do we hook up? Certainly psychoanalysis is going to write, persons interested in psychoanalysis are going to write a book, say like Religion as an Illusion, or Civilization and Its Discontents, to talk about strangled affect, is that the fruit from which civilization rises or bears comes to be. So it seems to me that we have an opportunity for interdisciplinary work on affect, to see if one discipline, religious studies and theology, can provide insights to the other, as the other, psychoanalysis can provide insight for us. Of course, Paul Tillich's The Courage to Be is so famous in this way, in recognizing the importance of psychoanalytic insight pertaining to doctrines of human nature. So to Winnicott, speaking of religion as an transitional object having to do with the inter-affective transitional space.
Yeah.
Thus, I look upon the work of Morty as another opportunity to expand our ability to work with others from other disciplines to understand the foundational structure of empathy and the way in which we are able to unstrangle strangled affect.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Very nice.
Very nice.
So, it sounds as if the book has meant many things to each of us, and that one of the cardinal things that we all agree with is that a spiritual experience is a very personal, affective experience. It may not be reducible and explainable in psychoanalytic terms, as Morty tries to do in the book. But the idea that the large majority of spiritual experiences have to do with some sense of belonging is compelling in and of itself. So at this point, I wonder if we could go around, and since part of our title had to do with the idea of the conceptual possibility of the soul as being thoroughly a neurobiological construct that is useful, I wonder if we might try to say something about what each of us might mean by soul.
Oh. Help. I can start.
You can go counterclockwise now.
We're going to go counterclockwise? Go ahead.
Yeah, start
Go
with.
ahead, Thandeka.
Any human experience has to be defined adequately, from my standpoint, from at least two perspectives. One, that of mentality, a reflection upon something, and the other from the standpoint of affect or the emotion. So thus, the human soul has to be described from two perspectives. That's Schleiermacher's basic claim. And thus he had two words to define the soul. One from the standpoint of the mind, or Geist, or spirit, which is an act of understanding. So, from the standpoint of an act of understanding, the soul pertains to that which we want to know by organizing it. So, Geist is one aspect or capacity of the soul.
And the act is the organization of it.
That's right. That is, if something hits my hand, I then focus attention as an act of understanding to discern what has altered my state, which is very different from the neurological processes or the initial ones of just feeling an impact of something upon me. So thus, Geist as the act of understanding that which has occurred. And that's a capacity of the soul. The other capacity of the soul, the two together being the soul, pertains to an affective state. And he used the term sila for that. So soul as an affective state, an alteration of affect, which has to be organized in order to be known. And thus the soul pertains to, from the standpoint of the body, a shift in its affective state. And from the standpoint of the mind, the organizing of the shift in order to discern what is going on. So thus I think we have to be, and then what's the link between the two? It's the actual movement back and forth as an effective movement back and forth, so that there is a sense of coherence and congruity.
So it's a dual aspect. Monism of sorts is it's not a dualism.
That's right. It's a polarity in this way, like a magnet with a negative and a positive charge. And the movement back and forth defines in this way the energetic field, the widest experience of that being, as Aristotle would say. How do we know that we have a soul? When we look up to the universe, we feel awe. From the standpoint of the mind, it's a state in which there is not an idea present. So it's an act of understanding in which there is not an object. And so the mind is empty. From the standpoint of the body, since the affective state has not been divided into this and that, instead of nothing being present, everything is present. And the meeting in this way of the emptiness of the mind and the fullness of the body is the classic state of a mystical experience in which emptiness and fullness are aligned. That basically is Schleiermacher's understanding of the soul, and I believe that Morty is drawing upon that.
Okay. Jaak, the soul.
So, I guess I got into trouble. We'll continue getting into trouble by using phrases like the biology of the soul. But I think ultimately there has to be a ground to experience. And I think the concept of soul within all intellectual traditions ultimately goes back to that people have the power of experience, and this goes down to some fundamental state, and that fundamental state needed a word, and we call that word the soul. And what the nature of that state is becomes the target of scientific inquiry quite easily. But that is a very big challenge for our culture as well as most other cultures around the world. I think is possibly a doable project. It will be very long time before anyone listens to it, with good resonance. But if that's a workable project, then we ought to get on with it and do it and figure out how to do it. And, we don't marginalize things. The traditional Christian view is painted on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, where Michelangelo gives, old bearded guy called God some magnificent power to touch Adam's finger, and the spark of the soul moves from one heavenly creature to a worldly creature. And that's been the traditional metaphor. And that metaphor causes great dangers because there's a certain arbitrariness to it, which, every time you have an arbitrary idea that captures the human imagination as powerfully as that has, we can look back in history and see that vision of the soul has caused great chaos. So I do have kind of timid hope that we can very slowly approach a different vision.
Okay. Siri?
Oh, boy. Well, I think, Morty brings this up, and it's something, of course, that we know, that the idea of spirit at root is about breath and breathing. And I do think that it has to be seen in opposition to when you're not breathing, you're dead. So that what soul or spirit is what we feel when we look at people and we know that they're alive. Quite simply that. And in that way, it is a biological quality. At the same time, that wholeness, anyone who's ever looked at the dead knows that that animation is gone. I think that Schleiermacher must have read Meister Eckhart, by the way. Well, there seems to be quite a bit of overlap. I was just looking at Eckhart again yesterday, and this idea of it's full of the idea of affect and feeling and the embodied God. Sorry, just a comment. And I have a quote from Kant that sort of goes with this too. I went back to dreams of a spirit seer, and this seems to be actually quite in light of the conversation and kind of biological and philosophical at the same time. He says, for spiritual ideas, stir up those pictures which are related to them and awake analogous ideas of our senses. These, it is true, would not be spiritual conceptions themselves, but yet they're symbols. Thus, it is not improbable that spiritual sensations can pass over into consciousness if they act upon correlated ideas of the senses. Not such a dumb guy.
Mm-hmm. And
you want to hear it again? Yeah, it's not so easy. But for spiritual ideas, stir up those pictures which are related to them and awake analogous ideas of our senses. These, it is true, would not be spiritual conceptions themselves, but yet they're symbols. Thus, it is not improbable that spiritual sensations can pass over into consciousness if they act upon correlated ideas of the senses.
And Schleiermacher would focus more on affect than senses in his terminology.
Or ideas as foundational, because in this way it would be a secondary process as opposed to the primary process.
Right. Mm-hmm. Right.
Right.
And you, Martin, sir?
I would approach it, unfortunately, completely differently. When I think about soul, what comes to my mind are the Romanesque pictures where the person is dying and something like a baby is coming out of the person who is dying's mouth, and that is the soul. Now, if I ask myself what is the soul, I'm inclined to think that we human beings are the only creature in the world who knows about our own death. No other creature seems to know that. What do we do with the knowledge? We deny it. We deny it in many ways. And one famous way of denying it is to say that only the body dies, but the soul survives. It goes to heaven or whatever it does. So to me, the soul is a term invented at a certain stage in the history of the world as a collective effort to deny the reality of death.
Well, that links up with what I said. I mean, that's very close to what I was saying.
But there's a difference.
I didn't think so, but okay.
Go ahead.
It's in opposition to death.
A different point here. Let's look at Paul's understanding of the body. He uses two Greek words to describe the body, sarx and soma.
Yeah.
Sarx is flesh and blood. Soma is that which will go on with the soul. Soma in this way being the whole self, psyche being one aspect of that, the reflective aspect on the whole self, so that he imagines that wherever human beings are, in whatever form, dead or alive, they're always going to be somatic. And thus, Paul's soul was somatic, emotional, affective, and energetic field. The light of the soul, as Jaak would say, or background, the visceral soul, as Damasio would say. So I think you are misreading in this way the history of Western religions when you separate the mind from its somatic existence. This certainly is not true within, as I understand it, the basic received thrust of the Judaic religion, certainly more so in Christianity, which tended to be more of an out-of-body experience because you had isolated selves as opposed to an identity that was inextricably interwoven with others. Martin Buber, of course, being the popularizer of this, and Martin Buber was taught by Wilhelm Dilthey, and Wilhelm Dilthey was the biographer of Schleiermacher and applied Schleiermacher's principles to the humanities and the social sciences, making psychology the foundational field for academic studies. moreover, in this way. So Buber's Ich und Du, or I and Thou, you find that's a gloss on Dilthey, which is a gloss on Schleiermacher. All of them are playing within the same field. And so within Schleiermacher, for instance, you have a definition of the self fundamentally different from the received tradition of Christianity, because the self in this way is always interaffective, always intersubjective, always related to others.
Right, but soul and self, I mean, this is what happens with this kind of language.
But soul and
self. Okay.
I will stick to the term soul in this way as background feeling and energetic feeling, that which through the acculturation process takes on certain patterning principles, which thus lets you know when you're in the presence of someone like yourself or not, simply by means of the way in which the person walks.
Right. Right. I think, of course, listen, in early photography, there was the belief that there were certain photographers who were talking about photographing the soul or the essence. I don't know if you've seen some of those photographs. They're amazing. It has to do with light. Yes, exactly. Light effects and all of that. Balzac thought you could bottle the soul. He was quite convinced that science was going to do it. I mean, there's been a lot of soul business, idea of material souls, etc., all through. And then, as you're talking about, far more theological, serious notions where the soul is, bodily, and then there's the Platonic tradition where, certainly Paul comes out of Platonic tradition as well, where the divorce is a bit more iffy.
I don't know. I tend to put Paul in the wider, the worldwide, Sanders, the worldwide feeling of solidarity as a member of the diasporic community.
So I would like to return to something that Martin had said about the soul as being a construct of creatures who are aware of their own endings. And in the talk I gave 2 weeks ago, I showed multiple pictures of my dog Merlin, who I think has a spiritual life of sorts, but it's lived. And he has no concept of his soul, but he is being it in every way, very much resonating with what your wife Anissa had said, or what you had said as well, as being in the moment of your existence. I think at this point, and we have an hour, and I think that we have a choice at this point. We can either go on with another set of definitions, or we might open up the conversation to our audience, because I feel that everyone here has something that they can relate to in what we've talked about so far. And so I would like to open it up to questions at this point.
Please stand up, come to the microphone when you go to ask the question. You have somebody. And state who you are when you are.
My name is Gerald Fuchs. Dr. Bergmann, I'm just a little surprised at your comment that psychoanalysis shouldn't address everything. Certainly in terms of human involvement and something as definition as spiritual and religion, and what you have written upon seems certainly to be the area that psychoanalysis should explore. I just have the impression that you've sort of stepped away, as if to say that Dr. Astow's book is perhaps a little misguided. I'm rather impressed by half of the book that I've read in his prior book. I mean, he defines, or tries to define, spirituality in a very broad way, and I think in just the brief time we've had here, I don't think everybody would be able to talk about soul. We've had a roundtable on soul, and by the time the roundtable is finished, nobody really quite understands what the definition of soul is. So I think you could go around, and I believe you participated in the roundtable. So the question is really, why isn't psychoanalysis able to step in to this arena and to step in, as Astow stepped in, as human beings relating to our development? There is a theological position being presented here that somehow or other an aspect of behavior, which we call theology, has some affective behavior, has something to do with theology, and it has theological or philosophical bases. I don't think it stands on any firmer ground than the ground that psychoanalysis and Mortimer Ostow brought to this particular subject.
Please.
All right, I would say the following, that psychoanalysis has something to say on certain subjects on which it has nothing of significance to contribute. I don't think it should go into it. So far as I understand, Freud, for very good reasons, was a very enthusiastic atheist that fitted into the culture in which he lived, and being the originator of psychoanalysis, he tried to get psychoanalysis into larger issues that it can handle. Basically, I think there is a certain tragic difficulty in psychoanalysis because many of our debates are on issues for which the analytic interview does not give an answer. So we fight over what we cannot really know. So I would say that Morty was a very different kind of a person. To him, to combine religious experiences with psychoanalysis was a very important thing, and to look upon it from the point of view of Morty's own inner development, it is certainly to be welcome. Whether or not he succeeded to do something which is convincing is, in my opinion, a question, but that doesn't detract from the value of it. Now, to make one more point, there is one area where psychoanalysis does touch on religion, and that is our attitudes towards death. We experience in our work many people who are afraid of death. That's one of the problems that we have. Just as we have people who cannot love, we also have people who are afraid of death. A patient of that type that I have said to me, I am absolutely convinced that before I die there will be a pill invented that will keep me immortal. Now that is a denial of a very basic aspect. But what I see that our job as analysts is to help people to understand their fear of death, why they cannot accept what is so evident. Whether if the person is helped by the belief in God, I would not enter into it. But I certainly do not, as an analyst, think that to me the belief in God is any help against the facing of death. I think that accepting the reality principle implies accepting death. And I go back to Freud's paper on transience, where he says that actually our capacity to recognize that life is passing enhances our capacity to enjoy life. So I accept Freud here, and I don't quite see why we should go into areas where we don't really have anything significant to offer.
Sorry.
Hold on.
Just
Whoa. Let's have a response from someone here in the panel, and then we'll get to another question, please.
I think Morty enjoyed wearing a variety of hats. He was obviously a psychoanalyst.
Disciplinary.
Yeah, and he was a neurologist, and he also was a budding scientist, and I think his love at the end of his life was really what science can contribute to all fields or aspects of human thought. And I think the book really says, are these issues scientific? The leitmotif is psychoanalytic. The big question is, can these issues be tackled by science with some kind of consensual agreement? And I think he suggested a way to try to do it. He has a hypothesis, he has a testable hypothesis, and he says, let's move on with the tests and see where they go. That's traditional scientific thought. It's not traditional psychoanalytic thought.
Thandeka?
Wasn't in Freud and Man's Soul, it wasn't Bettelheim sort of getting to this? I mean, you bring in the God thing, but isn't that straw horse? I mean, Bettelheim posed the whole question of whether Freud was dealing with spirit and soul in his writing, actually, and that the American translators of Freud tried to put it into more of a medical, change the translations to give them a more kind of a medical sound, the use of the vocabulary and so forth. But bringing in God, is not really the point in a certain sense. I mean, that was what Bettelheim was saying, that Freud himself was dealing with something we might call spirit or soul.
Well, of course, the accusation is that the English translation had substantially modified the meaning of Freud, but there is the famous statement that translators are traitors, and undoubtedly a certain change took place in the translation. Whether it's worth creating all of the fuss over the difference, I have sometimes tried to read the German and the English side by side, and you get some very interesting differences. But I am on the whole impressed with the serious effort with which Strachey tried to do justice to the material. And if I were Freud's translator, I'm by no means sure that I would have done a better job. Now, whether the word Seele is the same as the English soul, and by the way, when you spoke about Geist, but Geist is not exactly soul.
No, I said mind and spirit.
Yeah.
As the two poles, the mental and the organic and the mental. So I said mind and spirit.
Yeah, but in any case, the word for soul in German is Seele. It's not. Geist is again something completely different and very interesting. And that is translated by the word spirit. But why do we need the word spirit? Because it is not identical with soul.
I was simply trying to set up. Right.
She agrees.
She knows that.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So I gave 2. And Zela, perhaps because
Thandeka, you were going to make a comment.
Yes, just 2 small points. One, perhaps you're making religion a straw dog by defining it necessarily as entailing a concept of a deity. That certainly was not the case for Schleiermacher. When he used the term religion, it pertained to the cultural system of a particular people having to do with the traditional symbols of the way in which they ordered affect. And for Schleiermacher, it was not necessary to believe in a God, right, in order to be pious.
And Morty didn't go there as well in this book.
That's right. And then the second point, Morty refers many times to Anna Maria Risotto.
Yes.
Risotto.
Yeah.
And her basic claim, is it not, that if you as an analyst pay attention to the way in which your patient is talking about religion, you will find that it models the relationship of the patient to his parents. So that's another reason for you to pay attention to religious issues.
Okay, we have another question from the floor. Could you introduce yourself?
Larry Cutler, retired. I don't know if it's a question, but the best thing I like to start with is the title of this discussion. From here, mind, brain, and spirituality toward a biology of the soul. Toward a biology of the soul. We don't know if there is a soul. The only soul we know of, in general, is the soul that's been talked about for thousands of years, going back to the Greeks or before that, you know, and what is it? We do know there's a mind and a brain and spirituality, because this is a science. This is supposed to be a discussion of science. It's not a discussion, pardon me, of religion or theology. Excuse me.
It is.
Okay, maybe it is.
That's the point.
But anyway, I like what Mr. Bergmann said about that psychoanalysis cannot answer everything. I mean, if you take a look at all the things that go on in the world, psychoanalysis can answer very few of those things, or has answered very few of these things. And Freud himself knew that, and saw the mistakes he made in World War I. What he rooted for his country at first, then saw it was foolish, and then he had his civilization, his discontent, saw all these things. He didn't have the answers. Psychoanalysis does not have the answers. It does not have the answers maybe to why certain things happen. You know, it's certainly so valuable, but if you want to go for a biology of the soul, well, that's quite a job to do. It's like we had this cosmology thing 2 weeks ago where the Danish scientist said something about cosmology, how it's so new, it's how young, and it's only 400 years old, young. Well, the soul, I don't know if it's worth it. You want to try it, but it sure isn't, in my opinion, here yet. From a general point of view, how people look at words or how they think of it in this language, about soul.
I just have to say, I think we have to make some cuts here in the thing that, for example, everyone has to recognize that the soul is a cultural construct. It's a word that has a particular history in many contexts and many cultures. We're not talking about that little white thing in the photograph. And if anybody thinks that, you know, you can study neurons for the rest of your life, nobody's going to find that little white thing that's flying out into the space of the photograph. What you will find is maybe electrical activity and neurochemical activity that's associated with certain states, numinous states, the oceanic feeling, artistic states, whatever, that you can find. Neural substrates for that affect. But you're not going to find the soul.
Well, you might have to redefine it. You might have to redefine it. If you accept that people who were totally ignorant about these things had the truth about things, of course you're not going to make progress. If that's your ground state, you have to say there was something meaningful that they were trying to talk about, and now you try to say what was meaningful about it, and as you define that, you bring forth a different concept.
Right. And one of the reasons that I use Jaak's work in my classes and have my students read his textbook is that every once in a while Jaak will say, this is why traditional terms or ways of referring to the soul make absolutely no sense, because there has to be some kind of a neurological structure to it.
Right. Okay.
I'm David Goldman. I think I had the privilege of knowing Morty for many years through the neuroscience, and I respected him very much, and basically as an imaginative scientist. And I think we have to remember that one of the things that Morty enshrined was the fact that psychoanalysis is a science, and we're interested in studying natural phenomena, and we don't impose upon ourselves any artificial limitations. I think the idea of transcendent feeling and awe is an appropriate subject for us to understand. At the same time, we have to be true to our own tradition and not be quick to adopt terms that are heavily burdened by soul and spirituality. Remember, soul was a major debate point in science for more than 200 years and completely discarded. Spirituality also, unfortunately, is weighted down with excessive religious meaning, even though people like John Dewey in The Common Faith said there is a transcendental experience, and as Jaak pointed out, this represents the ability to socially bond, to imagine things on a larger scale. We must, at this particular point, resist every effort to be undermined by those who are mystical, who are believers, who say revelation is important, don't question, accept on faith. We can study as psychoanalysts every conceivable question and at the same time avoid getting caught up in this religious harmonization. It will only do us damage.
I'm getting a sense that Roy Herndon Smith, that there is an unaddressed polarity here. That we have two understandings of a set of terms that are in opposition to each other, and we haven't sharpened that opposition. And I want to raise that as a question of how you deal with that. On the one hand, we have the notion of soul, religious experience, spirituality as a particular set of experiences, particular phenomena, which you can study as an object. And you can look for explanations of that object, that phenomenon, as pathological, or as not pathological, or as having certain causes. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, it seems to me, we have a reflection which says that in fact, these terms refer to a fundamental aspect of human existence, which is foundational to how we know, how we experience, and how we relate, and how we exist. And that in fact you cannot investigate this solely as an object, these issues solely as an object, because you have to deal with the fact that the investigator is involved in, is a subject, that these are part of the subject of the investigation, that these are aspects of that. So that's one thing I want to clarify. One other just side issue. There's a nice Freud, and I'm going to misquote, but Freud had a certain fantasy at some point that one day there would be a plaque saying, "Here, the key to understanding dreams." Yes. Here Sigmund Freud discovered the key to understanding dreams. Is this not a certain understanding and vision of immortality? Hans Blumenthal, the historian of science, says that this is precisely the way science takes over the religious understanding of immortality, as depositing knowledge that exists forever, the scientist becomes part of, which is not all that dissimilar from traditional Christian and Jewish understandings of immortality. I'd like
to ask you a question.
Yes.
The two claims, two different vocabularies. The second being a fundamental aspect of human nature.
Mm-hmm. Fundamental aspect of how we know, exist, and act.
Right.
Therefore cannot be reduced or cannot be thought of purely as an object of thought, because it's part of our thinking.
Right. Part of our thinking.
And feeling and relating and existing.
Yes, but this is where I'm confused, truly confused, in terms of the separation that you're making. Mm-hmm. And I refer to Jaak's work on music. Mm-hmm. And the way in which music in this way is a voice of the emotions. Mm-hmm. And through its patterning principles, seem to be the catalyst for certain molecules which will send the organism into a certain affective state. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So Jaak refers to this as objectless knowing, as the Schleiermacher. So I can't yet get the distinction that you've made between the two, and I truly want to understand the distinction.
The distinction I'm making between the two is not necessarily about the actual studies that are being done. I'm talking about what's emerged in this conversation. And traditionally, psychoanalysis treats these terms purely as objects of study. in terms of phenomenon to be studied. It seems to me that what you're doing is saying that they are constitutive of the act of knowing and examining and understanding itself, and therefore cannot be understood purely as an object. And it's key distinction because of something you said, which is most descriptions that we have here, we've talked about spirituality as certain experiences that are in some ways phenomenal in a different sense. They are exceptional. You did not talk about them that way. You talked about this level, this experience, as an ongoing constant in human existence, whether we are aware of it or not. And that in some ways that you talked about strangled emotion and feeling, but underlying that, and you said that this is something that can be felt constantly, ongoing, and it's an ongoing substrate, a foundation of how we exist and are. That's why I think this distinction is important, and I think
I have it. Then one more question. Mm-hmm. Are you then saying that psychoanalysis has to move out of its 19th century Newtonian model?
I think it already has, because I think psychoanalysis began, in fact, and I think this is where what's really interesting on Freud. Freud later in his life may have been an atheist, but he talked about his gods, his mythology, and he investigated Judaism and Moses and monotheism as in many ways a basis as leading to psychoanalytic investigation of consciousness. Freud's basic insight was that consciousness is not separate from the body and the determining aspects of that, and that you cannot, in some ways, the break with the early scientific psychology in Freud, that's central to, it seems to me, psychoanalytic method, is the turning of the subject back on itself and this re-examination of the self. I think that Freud's fascination, religion, and had a lot to do with that. Peter Homan's work, The Ability to Mourn, Disillusionment, Disillusionment and the Social Origins in Psychoanalysis deals with this a great deal.
So I'm suggesting this is where we meet, you and I. Good.
Thank you.
May I answer that? Or may I say something? First of all, this was said by Freud on July 24, 1897. It's reproduced in the letter to Fries, and it's a statement that Freud made before he discovered psychoanalysis. Actually, asking for a plaque to commemorate is an extremely modest reward, considering what Freud actually was. But at that time, he was walking through the Vienna University, and there were commemorations of the various professors, and he was wondering whether his statue will be there. The answer is he has outranked all of them many times over. So that is the interesting part of it. From a psychoanalytic point of view, I would say that Freud did believe that the world or that nature is a little bit like a woman, and you have to uncover her secrets. No doubt it had a sexual basis for this observation, but it also contains a sublimation of it. The mysterious lady is not an actual lady, but the dream, and the fact that he could translate it and put the energy in investigating the nature of a dream is, in my opinion, a magnificent example of sublimation.
Let me try to shift the discussion back to the biology of the soul and science, and whether science can do anything useful, or, it's as useless as religion has been on the topic. Ultimately, there's a ground of being for mentality. What is mind? And neuroscience and psychology and psychoanalysis and all the human disciplines have a great difficulty dealing with that, because whatever it is very ancient, is very deep in the nervous system, is just not completely in the nervous system. It could be in other places. Some people like to put it up in the sky, some ethereal things coming out of the mouth. People have all kinds of ideas about it. I think science ultimately had to mature, and the maturation has been in the form of neuroscience, even though it's, a baby in diapers at the present time. But it at least has a right to be around the table and discuss these issues, and to suggest testable hypotheses. And then you have to define what you're talking about. And I'm going to be willing to define whatever the soul is, that's the ground of mentality. The ground of mentality. Then the question is, what is mind? And, the neuroscientist now says, of course, mind is just the functions of the brain.
Right.
And as soon as one thinks about that, one immediately says, that's impossible, because a mind in a vat, a brain in a vat, has very little mind.
Right.
It's impossible for, floating up this mass of protoplasm disconnected to the world to have anything to think about, anything to feel about. It can't live on its own. The only thing that allows it to live is the body. So the body is part of it. And of course, much of our intelligence is out in the world. So, sophisticated people now say, whatever it is, it's the brain function within a body working in a rich environment, etc., etc. So that is the biological view. You've got to deal with that. On the other hand, on the other side, across the, dark river of ignorance, we have, historical views. The most extreme historical view is that it is disconnected from matter completely. It is a spooky substance. It's the ultimate of dualism. It is not connected to the material. They just join forces for a moment, and then they go their separate ways at death. That's the far extreme. The more sophisticated extreme there is what William James said, and what quantum consciousness is saying right now, that there is a fundamental property of matter, and that fundamental property presently is unknown, but it expresses itself at the quantum level. And William James used a lovely term, mind dust.
Yeah.
Mind just permeates us. Mind just permeates the universe, and then it coalesces in, creatures and concentrates in some way.
No, but I think this is really right. I mean, what Jaak is saying too is something that I've always thought. It is theoretically possible to imagine a brain in isolation. It is not theoretically possible to imagine a mind in isolation. And this is where the whole intersubjective material comes in. In other words, a mind is also culture, the other, everything. Yeah. So creating those borders is extremely difficult.
Yes.
Yeah.
Also, I think it's very helpful here to remember Winnicott's analysis of the mind-body problem and the way in which, in toxic environments, the so-called mind begins to act in place of the environment as if it is an autonomous self.
Yeah, yeah.
And thus his magnificent article on the fear of breakdown and the way in which we cannot take into experience certain kinds of trauma and thus act as if we're trying to prevent what has already occurred.
Yeah.
So I think we have a rich literature, a very rich literature on the way in which the duality comes to be.
Right, and also this idea
fictive.
of the false self, which, picks up on that.
Oh, sorry.
Yes, sir.
I'm curious. I'm not sure that the question I have is relevant to the panel in the sense that I'm not sure there's somebody present except possibly the novelist. When you read that passage from the book, it struck me that it could equally have been in a context of the aesthetic rather than the spiritual.
Correct.
And nothing has been mentioned of any association with whatever that entire tradition is. And Zach's comment, about it grounding this in the body, then is interesting if we think back to the earliest origins of art entering our humanity. Where, if people involved in the development of the brain or whatever see any changes, see any basis there in the evolution that would associate those two. And therefore, then one might have an entirely different tradition of language, that others have brought to this in attempting to explain what we're talking about. And that we are, I'm not sure what the word is, that the panel is a consequence of the current overwhelming dialogue of religion and spirituality that seems to have taken place everywhere and pushed a lot of things aside, in our approach to what it is to be human.
Jaak or Siri, would you like to comment?
Well, as a writer who writes fiction, I think that there probably is huge overlap. When you're writing, you lose yourself. You go into, I think of it sometimes as a transport or a specific kind of state, and I'm sure there are hundreds of artists and people who aren't artists who will tell you the same thing. And I would suggest, and Jaak could back me up or not back me up, that probably some of the neural states that underlie those conditions are overlapping as well. I can't imagine that they wouldn't be.
The tradition of the muse.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah, anything?
Well, I was actually looking for a poem that a friend in Britain wrote of what it is like to be a brain in a vat. And unfortunately, my computer does not carry that.
Right. It's because it's a brain in a vat. That's why.
Must be awfully
Thandeka, you're going to say.
Yes, I'm very excited by your comments because Schleiermacher puts his doctrine of the soul in his aesthetics, since it pertains to the structure of human nature and is an Affektenlehre, a doctrine of affect. And thus you find in his analysis of the soul, in his aesthetics, the analysis of music and the way in which music is the voice of the emotions. So Schleiermacher is not understood because it's assumed as a theologian that his doctrine of human nature would be in his theology, like Luther's conscience or Calvin's conscience. But it's not. It's in the arts. The explanation's there because it's the way in which we experience creation as a stir of creativity. And that the original artist for Schleiermacher is God. And thus everything God has created is a stir of creation. And this is before the doctrinal claims of actual belief in a God or a deity or whatever. But it's absolutely, his doctrine of the soul is found in his aesthetics.
And
do research on the aesthetic rather than the spiritual in your field. People who have attempted to create hypotheses that will test of the relationship of the aesthetic emerging from.
There's actually very little substantive neuroscience work on the topic. I think we're finally getting to a point where one can ask those questions in an interesting way because we have enough causal manipulations, primarily neurochemistry, and certain kinds of brain damage. There are actually forms of brain damage where a great musician says, after my stroke, the music moves me so profoundly compared to what it did before. Mm-hmm. If I was given another choice to have another stroke, I would willingly take it. Mm-hmm. Just to move another notch higher to having a total immersion of the soul, whatever.
I could give you one experience I had on Monday. Of using oxytocin, which is a hormone in the brain which is helps to underwrite attachment and bonding and belonging and being part of the world beyond oneself. And being in an fMRI machine without the oxytocin and then with the oxytocin was certainly an aesthetic first-person experience as opposed to a third-person sort of uncomfortable experience. And
you were in the machine?
I was not the machine. I was in the machine, as were others. Yes, we're doing a study on an fMRI study on it. Maggie.
So I'm Maggie Zellner, and I sort of wanted to add to the project of sort of sharpening the distinctions, which someone had said earlier, right?
Yes.
Because and so much of this discussion hinges on definitions. Because first of all, if we're interested in the biology of the soul, it seems to me it's an easy project if what you're just interested in is the neural correlates of people's spiritual experience.
Right.
Because people can self-report, I'm feeling pretty normal today, or I'm feeling spiritually connected, I'm having a higher experience, I'm having an altered experience, and you could conceivably put them in a scanner or put electrodes on their head, and you could see what's different in the brain between an everyday state and a spiritual state. Mm-hmm. But then there's the question about what does that represent, right? And then there's the definitional question of, is there a soul in the sense of something that will live after death or not? That's a separate question. And then there's another question about whether certain spiritual states represent pathology.
Yep.
On the one hand, or perhaps spiritual states represent higher levels of health. And it's possible that the healthier that we are as individuals, the more likely we are to have spiritual experiences. So all of those, I think, are questions that remain to be determined. But I think I just wanted to add to that because you could feel sort of like the energy in the room change, like all of a sudden when it felt like there was an argument going on about whether there is a soul or not. And is the idea of the soul a delusion and a mechanism of denial, or is it the description of something that's inherent, you know? And I think that reasonable people can see those questions in very different ways. So it really just depends on how we define it.
Thank you.
You had a question?
Yes, sir. Introduce yourself, please.
My name is Michael Stone Richards. Before I get to my main point, the gentleman across the way who mentioned a moment ago that this roundtable is taking place because religious issues, because of contemporary events, seem to have pushed everything aside. And I would actually say that's too easy, that it's the persistence of the religions in spite of modernity that is the real issue. And so it's the contemporary rationalist, as it were, who thinks, why don't these dreadful people just get with the program? Well, the program has been modernity for 200 years. And so the question is, to what extent the religious issues represent a crisis in modernity? And to that extent, then, this discussion has got absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with current events. This is a discussion that has never stopped since the Enlightenment, and it means then that the Enlightenment project has not fulfilled its promise. And maybe the real crisis is that the Enlightenment project will collapse. That is why I think this debate is happening, and it's not a trivial one. The point that I wanted to make to colleagues here, and a question in the form of a comment, is this. In many debates that I've participated in here, particularly when Marcia Cavell has been here, it's been stated very, very clearly that language of mind is not possible without language of matter in some way, but that one is not reducible to the other. That is just now pretty standard philosophy right across the board. But there's another part of it, it seems to me, that is not working its way into this debate, that makes the question of whether we believe in the soul or not in a religious sense completely beside the point. And it is that, it's the idea of emergent properties and emergent qualities, and it is that certain things are only possible once certain levels of sophistication and complexity have been reached. And so one of the properties of human mind is reflexivity. And it is and recursiveness, what linguists call recursiveness. And it is only when certain perceptual richness, certain linguistic richness, certain cultural richness are concurrently available that certain kinds of perceptions become possible. And it strikes me that that is the issue here, that if we're saying that the soul is a social construct, or whether we're saying that the soul is subject to a certain kind of perception, or is that which yields a certain kind of perception, that in any case we cannot address that until we can adequately address what it means to say, through the property of recursion, that complexity yields unforeseen results, whether we're speaking of physics or whether we're speaking of property of mind, and surely in the context of human culture we're speaking of the property of mind. And so that this debate is not per se about differences of ontology between those who do believe or those who don't. It's rather a question about what kinds of structures yield the possibility of certain kinds of perceptions. In other words, what kinds of structures make it possible for us even to have this meaningful debate?
At all.
Right?
Yeah.
Very nice.
Absolutely.
Very nice.
Yes. No, it's beautiful.
Ed?
Yeah, may I make a...
Yeah.
Please.
I'm Ed Nersessian. The first thing I'd like to say is that Jaak has been challenging us for a long time, especially psychoanalysts, since he's been in contact with psychoanalysts now on a regular basis for about 10 years, about testable hypotheses and testable results. I'd like to challenge him today publicly, because my private challenges have not amounted to anything, that he come up with a project and submit it to Philoctetes, and we will certainly do everything to make sure that he does the work for us. The other thing is, before everybody, in terms of soul, it's not something I can tell you anything about, because as a psychoanalyst I know nothing about it. I know something about what I call the mind, which to me is essentially what people think, do, love, ambition, hate, wishes, desires. That's the kind of thing a psychoanalyst is involved in. And I don't think from that he can go into much more fanciful concepts like soul. But before everybody here or anywhere else who is in analysis decides that they want to follow Martin Bergmann's suggestion and not analyze everything, I'd like to tell them that I disagree with that. I agree with him that psychoanalysis does not explain anything and should not even try to explain everything. Psychoanalysis is a very limited type of exploration, and it has to do with understanding a single individual at a single time, at a single moment in time. And as such, if somebody comes in with the experience like Martin Bergmann had in the mountains and reports it in a session, it would behoove every analyst to look and understand what that is about. Not in order to have a preconceived answer, such as what it seems, I haven't read Marty's book, Marty suggests that every such experience has to do with the relationship with the mother. It may or may not. And psychoanalysis is far beyond the time where everything has a single explanation. People are a lot more complicated, and most things have many kinds of explanation. But it is a chance for the person on the couch who has had that experience to use it to learn something more about themselves. And the essence of psychoanalysis is to develop that ongoing curiosity of wanting to understand why one does and feels and thinks what one does, feels and thinks.
May I answer this?
I think I have to answer that. I have to answer that. No, not
you said something important, and that was if the patient reports it. If a patient reports it, of course, there is something to analyze. But that is not what Morty is saying. What Morty is saying is that the experience as such can be investigated psychoanalytically, and this is what I am doubtful about, because we are no good at things which are non-conflictual. Now, the characteristic of these experiences is that they are all very beautiful, they are entirely ego-syntonic, and unless they are reported to the analyst, which I doubt very much, they are beyond our capacity or even our relevance.
Now I have to say that I disagree stronger than I did before. It doesn't matter if it's the patient who reports it or not. If I have it and I am on the mountains, I can decide whether I want to look into it or I don't want to look into it. The fact that I would look into it may enlighten me further about all sorts of things. And so I don't think there is a one answer, but I think it is an opportunity to explore oneself. And I think in some instances, such as Freud's own experience at the Acropolis, more insights can be gained from such unusual experiences.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Ed. Let me answer the other part of your interesting comment, and very welcome comment, I might say, because in private you've never been quite as pointed.
It's your fault, Ed.
And there's nothing more I love than a truly pointed question, because the kind of project you're asking from me is one that I readily have in my mind, and no one has ever asked me this, nor you in the past. You've asked about a creativity project, and that's not my shtick. I'm doing the kind of research which I truly want to do, and even though it's a creative project, it's a very different kind of project. But it is very similar to Hubble Space Telescope. It's very similar to, having big cyclotrons. It would require big science, probably bigger than, a small institute could support. But I'm happy to share.
Cut down your ambition.
I'll give you the big project, and I'll give you the little project. And the big project is similar to what the Allen Brain Institute did recently. Does everyone know? The Allen Brain Institute is situated in Seattle, and a big robber baron decided to do something for science, so they set up a Brain Institute, and they just published their first big project in Nature in January, and it took them 5 years and $10 million.
$10 million.
Yeah, $10 million in 5 years, and they had to recruit hundreds of people to do it because no one else could manage a job that large. And it was simply asking a mouse brain, which essentially was the first mammal after humans to have the genome transcribed. And you've got this genetic orchestra operating in the brain, and they wanted to know how every gene in every corner of the brain is playing its tune when the organism is doing nothing special, which is uninteresting, but someone has to do it. That's background data. So now they can start doing interesting work, but without that foundation, no building can be built. So they published that. Took them 5 years and $10 million. So what is my, Hubble telescope? It is simply that when Penfield described that there was, in fact, a sensory homunculus on either side of the post-central gyrus, and there's a motor homunculus on the pre-central gyrus. Very interesting. Fundamental representation of the organism in the highest reaches of the brain on the neocortex. There is enough evidence that there are other homunculi in the brain that have never been mapped.
Wow.
Wow, sends shivers up my spine too. And no one's even talking about those homunculi. And those are the homunculi of the more important parts of our body, our viscera. That is where we live. That is where our emotions are. That's where our heart, our stomach, those butterflies. There are homunculi because we know they exist. We know approximately where they exist, but we do not have an image of the body. And we don't have an image of the dynamic of the body. And I feel very confident it does exist. But what does that require? I mean, it requires the following type of experiment, where essentially you sweep through the relevant continents, neural continents, with very systematically placed sensors, thousands of them, in a geometric grid. And you find both how that grid is responding to challenges in the organism, and you will find a heart, and you will find stomachs, and you will find things that will be blending and shifting dynamically. And you also stimulate those, each one successively, to see which corner of the visceral homunculus moves. And I think then you will begin to have a biology of the soul. Then you will have. That requires hundreds and hundreds of people working together, which is very difficult to pull together. People have to be paid off to do that. It's a simple fact of life. You know, big buildings don't happen otherwise. The pyramids wouldn't. That's always the case.
That was slavery.
Huh?
That was slavery.
Yes. There's still a lot of that. And but the smaller project is really more workable. In other words,
well, how much would the big project be?
I don't know. I haven't. I can't even imagine. One would have to sit down with a bunch of people and really figure it out in detail. And I haven't.
I figure it's about 425 million.
26 maybe, but maybe not much more. The more workable project is simply we have created a society that is not deeply committed to human values, whatever that means, which is that, children are allowed to grow up as fully feeling creatures in the world, that their feelings are respected, that we have an emotional education where kids just love to learn, as opposed to, sitting there and being bored out of their minds, which happens to most of the kids. We know that Mother Nature has provided them the tools for learning that are happy. Every child is a scientist and explorer. They love to go out in the woods. Now we have the nature deficit disorder.
Which could get worse.
The social brain is not in the genes. The social brain is how certain simple tools of the nervous system working in a rich cultural environment put together a social brain. If you don't use this force of playfulness to construct a fully social brain with all of the emotions respected, then we will have more ADHD, we will have more childhood problems, we will have more criminals on the street, we will have more drug abuse. As soon as we start to bring those children up as complete human beings whose emotional lives are respected, then we have the possibility of a different world. I want to have a play sanctuary. I want to have a first play sanctuary where science and education can work together and see how far we can push the joyful aspects of life to make a more complete human being.
We have less than 5 minutes.
Thoreau, Rousseau, and Tolstoy.
Why not?
One last question.
Yes, we have less than 5 minutes. We have one last question, please.
I think I'm still a bit confused. Karen Rood, thank you. About the enterprise here today, because not that you haven't said a lot of worthwhile things, but the word soul to me seems to have such a loaded history to it. I'm still confused about how you can take that word and identify it with something you can analyze. And if it is, are you saying it's a basic state? soul, perhaps? Because when I'm unconscious during a medical procedure, where does my soul go then? You know, it doesn't.
Exactly.
And so that aligns me in the end with Mr. Bergmann, because it doesn't seem to exist when I'm not here. So I'm grappling with what soul means.
I don't know if it's there or not because you're asleep.
Okay.
No,
I'm thinking about that. I have no recollection.
Let me not kid. That is a very important question. And if you make the assumption that soul is connected to our capacity for mentality with a lot of deep feelings, then how that emerges from the body and brain and world working together, that is the question. And I think we know how to create, soulful environments. We know how to maintain a healthy body that is, resonant with dance and the arts and exercise and good eating, how it will help participate in the activity. What we really don't know is how the brain participates in it, but the foundation of mentality is ultimately the foundation of consciousness. And you can ask simple questions like, where is the smallest area of brain damage that will compromise what you call consciousness? When you're given a drug, it just floods the whole system, but there are areas that are hot spots for consciousness. There are areas that one can say is the very smallest area that if you damage, you are gone. And I would say, now your soul has been sucked away from you forever. Whatever other people may mean by it, that is what I mean by it. And I'm willing to talk about my definition and not about someone else's definition. Because I think ultimately it's deeply neurobiological. It deeply represents the body. The body doesn't work unless it's symbolized neurosymbolically in the brain, and no one's working on it.
So unlike Siri, you think that, I think Siri said that you can see the soul not being there when the person is dead. But what he's saying is the person can be alive, but the tiny part of the brain that has to do with consciousness is destroyed, and there is no soul anymore.
That's where the highest concentration, not the complete location.
It's important to understand that language itself is a metaphor, okay? This is what you so eloquently tried to talk about, that we are always using metaphors, that words themselves are metaphors for something else, and that's why everyone gets tied up into this. And there's a certain level of consciousness or self-consciousness that is required before we can even have this discussion. And it's not, I think, that double awareness, that self-awareness of the I as other is further up.
Yes, recursive.
Exactly.
There's a recursion to this. In other words, practically everything in the brain gets re-represented. That's the wonderful thing. That allows us great plasticity. But then, of course, the question is, what is more fundamental than something else?
Right.
What is the most fundamental thing that needs to be re-represented? That is an open neuroscientific.
So perhaps also we're talking about the capacity for congruence and coherence. And the soul refers to that funcking, that capacity.
And with that comment, we reach congruence and an ending. And thank you to all of our speakers and to